Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. Our guest today is Dan Nixon. He's a writer and researcher specialising in themes around attention, environmental philosophy, and digital culture. A particular area of interest and expertise is the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty, and he's also a mindfulness teacher. He's written a couple of essays for Aeon, and his ideas have been picked up and discussed in the Sunday Times, the Economist, and the Guardian, among others. And he co-leads Perspectiva's work on the digital ego. He's going to talk to us today about cultivating a spirit of questioning in relating to our digital lives. Hello, Dan. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Hi, Barry. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. By the way, just before we start, if you look at my attire, I'm not actually a monk. It's just our boiler's broken down, and so I've just got one of these hoodies, which actually they're brilliant.
Yeah.
Anyway, so my first question, Dan, is could you begin by telling us something of your background and how you became interested in this topic?
Sure. So I studied maths and philosophy at university, and then went on to do a graduate degree in economics, basically because I didn't understand anything about economics. I wanted to kind of find my way in that discipline a bit, and found myself working after that in the central bank here in the UK as an economist. So public sector policy work around macroeconomics. And it was during my 10 years that I spent in that walk of life that I became increasingly interested in this idea that was talked about, which is the attention economy. So this idea that in the digital phase of capitalism that we're in now, that it's digital platforms competing for our attention, to grab our attention, to hold our attention, is seen increasingly as kind of very central concept or even framing for understanding the digital economy that we're all part of in some way or another. And so while I was at the central bank here in the UK, I wrote a couple of blog posts on the crisis of attention, what was going on maybe from an economic narrative around our attention. But really my interest blossomed into really being curious about attention, awareness itself, how this is for us, how we may cultivate it. And my personal encounter with mindfulness, with meditation, with yoga and qigong and other contemplative practices really made me think there's something here that I really want to look at in more detail. So for the last 5 years, I've been leading work around attention in the context of our digital culture, and also thinking about broader environmental situations that influence our attention as individuals, as societies as well, and working with NGOs like the Mindfulness Initiative and Perspectiva, as you mentioned, leading projects around this. I also teach mindfulness meditation practices in workplace contexts as well. So that really was the impetus for me, my own experience encounter with those contemplative traditions, and maybe we'll talk as well about some philosophical schools of thought that really prized attention and perception as actually central. I found extremely enriching, and so really took it from there.
Okay, so you mentioned perception. So I first came across your work with the essay, "What is the case for continually questioning our online experience?" So and you mentioned perception there. So you frame the topic around how we see the world around us. So why do you think this framing is especially helpful in the context of debates about our relationship with technology?
Sure. So exactly that essay is really exploring what does it mean to bring a questioning attitude, a spirit of questioning towards our relationship with tech. So and we'll go into kind of the kind of questions and the kind of investigations we can maybe practice and explore in that process, vis-a-vis smartphones, vis-a-vis the internet and digital spaces and so on. But as you said, I framed the overall discussion there around what it is to see the world around us. And I just find this basic framing of how are we seeing the world, coming back to that question, what am I seeing? What kinds of perceptual experience am I having? Is really helpful when we think about our relationship with tech, because on the one hand, we know that our technologies for sure really influence what we see, what we're looking at. We're staring at our phones and using our computers for good and for bad. And of course, the way that we're getting information, when some global news event breaks, and what we all see will be maybe a function of which social media you may be using or which other media channels, and who you follow. So certainly how we get information and learn about the world and how we see what's going on is hugely influenced through tech. Just to think that Twitter and the iPhone and Facebook and so on, they're all give or take 20 years old or thereabouts. I mean, they're still new technologies, but they absolutely shape how we see the world around us. Also how we see each other. I mean, of course, we're using Zoom here, but how we stay in touch with friends and family through social media, through messaging apps and so on. It's really, really, loads to explore as to how we're seeing each other and the world through tech. So tech shapes how we see the world. But I think what's also really interesting is the Silicon Valley kind of model of the Silicon Valley worldview tends to see perception itself in a very particular way. So from a Silicon Valley perspective, if you're Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, tend to see the world in terms of data, in terms of information. So, me seeing you or seeing objects around the room now would be kind of more or less, understood in terms of, there's data that I'm receiving through my sense organs and maybe putting together in the central processing unit of my brain, and I'm getting information about the world and perceiving the world through this kind of data inputs and data processing. And actually, on the one hand, that's one way to look at the human act of perception, but there's also very different ways of thinking about perception. And so I look to the work of various artists and also the school of philosophy that's called phenomenology, which we may talk about, which I think treats these approaches treat perception in a very different way, much richer and much more to explore and engage with, and much more central to what actually it is to be human than that kind of very reductionist approach that you would find in the way tech companies talk about perception. So to give you an example, actually, I mean, the kind of next frontier of digital technology for many is considered to be the metaverse. This idea of Mark Zuckerberg will say, rather than staring at screens on our phones, on our laptops, we want to have headsets or smart glasses where we can really see what's going on in 3D and add layers to the world around us, or enter in entirely virtual spaces. And this all sounds really fantastic, and I'm sure there'll be lots to explore with this. But when it comes to how we see the world, Zuckerberg will say, for instance, that with the technologies we now have, with the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, our digital systems can now see what we see. He says they can hear what we hear. They can see the world just as we do. And actually, there's so much kind of assumed there, but actually, when we come back to much richer accounts of what it is to see in the first place, we find actually what's going on with how technological systems can engage with their environment is a very, very different thing, I think, from what it is to perceive. So we can unpack that. But that was the kind of impetus for looking at that kind of framing, how we see the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm just thinking about the whole project from Facebook, which is now called Meta. What's interesting is that the trajectory of that company has actually taken a huge dip recently with this gamble. Do you think there is actually some kickback from the wider community that about going down this road? Because this idea of information, you seem to be saying in some ways that the tech world sees the human organism a bit like a computer, that we are and not an embodied being. So Well, those two things, because
Sure.
you talk about you said phenomenology is something that could play a part in this other view you're putting forward. Could you maybe talk about that as well a bit, as well as that idea
Sure.
about meta, whether there's any kickback?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and I'm no expert on the kind of, financial position of these companies. Certainly a lot of tech has taken a hit recently, and not just those ones that are focused more on the metaverse. As you said, Meta, Facebook are very much in that direction. And I think it is fair to say, when it comes to ambitions and promises and excitement and hype around this concept of the metaverse, I mean, it has, I think there has been pushback that people are somewhat underwhelmed by the gap between the rhetoric of this whole new world of possibility and the reality that actually this stuff is very early, and actually it's really, really hard to replicate or represent. Perhaps impossible to represent ourselves as 3D avatars in a digital world for all of the technology that may be going into it. And of course they're early in their journey, and things will get much better. But I think what's very interesting around this, and the way that Zuckerberg, for instance, will push the idea of the metaverse, is he really wants to go big on the basic kind of fundamentals of human connection. That for him, rhetoric full of how we connect and how we spend time with each other. So he says that the feeling of presence, that the sense of presence of being with another person, is the defining characteristic of the metaverse. So in his view, if me and you put on our headsets, and if I'm programmed as a 3D avatar that looks a lot like me, and you like you, Barry, and the kind of dimple on your face and kind of like this micro expressions will be really, Zuckerberg says, you'll see your friends' facial expressions, you'll see their body language. And that's not, and so he's really kind of big on this basic human interaction, social interaction we can do in a virtual space. And actually, of course, when you look into what actually is going on, I mean, for all of the talk about getting away from screens and being embodied and being immersed in the experiences Zuckerberg talks about, of course, at the end of the day, what we'd be doing is putting a screen very, very close to our eyes, the headset or the smart glasses. And what I'd be seeing, it's true that the inputs I would be getting from you would maybe be mapping some of your actual movements with your arms and with your face and so on. There'll be things tracking, for instance, tracking maybe how your face looks in the future, and tracking changes in the dilation of your pupils and so on. And that will be communicated to me with the avatar that I see. But even so, ultimately, what I will actually be seeing is not your facial expressions unadorned, as Zuckerberg promises, but actually an extremely impressive and complex AI rendering of what your facial expressions and body language might be, or we think probably could be. And they'll use all kinds of shortcuts like standardized hand movements. So what you'll find is in the early examples of metaverse interactions that you can see online, and there's an interview of Nick Clegg, who's their, I think, head of policy, with Henry Mance from the Financial Times, and you can see the kind of the 2D video of their interaction on Twitter and online. And what you see is their hands, Nick Clegg's hands are moving around. They're really fidgeting, and the reason is the trackers on his hands are really, one-to-one mapping. Anything he's doing is shown on the screen, and it kind of looks like he's really, really fidgety because they haven't maybe calibrated. They need to smooth that out and stuff. So over time, of course, that's a technical challenge. They'll get much better at making that smoother. But fundamentally, what you're going to be seeing will always be, yes, some inputs from what the other person's actually doing, and then a whole load of code, essentially, and algorithms to make it look what they call realistic, which includes standardizing things and so on.
That what you just said there just makes me think of, when you go into a restaurant or something, and you see on the table a absolutely beautiful bunch of flowers, and you think how wonderful. And then when you get really close, they're a fantastic replica. They're made of plastic. It's that sense of we engage with the embodiment with it rather than the airsats vision we get with the plastic thing. And I think there's something similar to that as well. Even no matter how well they do it, you're not, it's not the same, is it?
It's not the same. And it's really interesting. So as I think where the metaverse trips up, what I was going to say leads exactly from that is some of the more fantastical and kind of, alternative reality type applications. So for example, educationally, we could put on headsets and be maybe in a rendering of the Amazon rainforest. It won't be the same as really being there. That's true. But we may get a sense of the biodiversity and learn about, and see in a 3D way the different species of fauna and flora. So we can do fantastical things. We could maybe imagine what it's like to go to space and really feel like looking down on the Earth. Maybe these will be great educational and recreational and gaming experiences. But it's the subtle things of actual embodied, sometimes mundane day-to-day life. And we've talked about me seeing you and actually just the subtlety of the human face, for example. But you mentioned the flowers. And what's interesting when I was looking at these demonstrations of the metaverse is I saw Mark Zuckerberg presenting, and he was against a backdrop of kind of an alpine kind of backdrop. There was some in the distance behind him. There's some mountains with trees, and you could see like little, algorithmically coded swaying of some of the trees just swaying a little bit, and you could think, oh yeah, someone there's thought, oh, we want to give it that sense of realness. We want to have that kind of, hard to define. And here's the thing, you can probably do you can go so far and you could make it like, wow, it so feels like the real deal. But the fundamental is it's actually different though, because someone's coded that in a really, really great program. And I really salute that. And it's great to use that, like I said, in all kinds of applications, but as a substitute for what it is to be in the world. And this is why for this whole debate around tech, I think coming back to what we see and what we perceive is really important, because it's easy to talk about our attention and how we use our attention, and we can have a whole discussion around that. And it's easy, of course, to talk about information, what's true and what's misinformation, and that's really, really important as well. But simply to be curious and interested moment to moment in what we're actually experiencing, what we're actually perceiving, I think is a great starting point for so many things, especially our relationship with tech. And you asked me to talk about phenomenology. So briefly, in my view, if you look at the various schools of philosophy and approaches to thinking about questions of who we are and how we explore the world and make sense of the world around us, phenomenology really centers on this idea that we have to come back to what our actual everyday experience in the world is actually like. So rather than rushing to explain the world, to explain what humans do or how the world is through various theories, various abstract frameworks and so on, the problem with that approach is we can very quickly get lost in the theory itself, in the conceptual framework. And you see this in all branches of science and so many branches of philosophy. And there's a very good reason for this. When we want to really look empirically at how something operates in the natural world, we use scientific methods, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. But philosophically speaking, in terms of making sense of it all and thinking about what is the human being and what is our relationship with the world, phenomenology says, before you get too caught up in all these different abstractions and theories and ideas, because if you read, to the listener here, if you're not a student of philosophy, if you just go to a philosophy shelf in the bookstore and just open up a book, it's extremely abstract. Nearly all philosophical writing is very conceptual and very quick to define different concepts and different abstract terms and create a kind of worldview that takes you actually a long way from your actual day-to-day experience. So phenomenology says, can we come back again and again to what our actual lived experience is like, and start from there and actually describe what our experience is like moment to moment, rather than being in a rush to try and explain it all and have a theory that explains everything. So to give an example, if we think about meeting a friend for a coffee in a cafe in your town, and from so many schools of academic disciplines, you might explain that interaction with your friends. So a sociologist may look at the social norms and conventions that dictate, catching up for a coffee and what's going on in different cultures around what it means to socialize in that way. Maybe from neurophysiology, you might look at the effect of caffeine on the brain and the body, and how that changes our body and alertness and the conversation we're having. From the perspective of economics, you might look at the demand and supply of coffee beans and how that's affecting the price of the cappuccino that you're buying, and so on. And philosophers similarly, they abstract even further typically from the actual experience, and maybe a philosopher would often ask questions like, how do you know that your friend is really there and not some kind of phantasm or some zombie, and that's great. All of these lines of inquiry can be useful, but the phenomenologists say, but what's it actually like to meet your friend, to make eye contact across the bustling cafe, to hear the whirring of the espresso machine in the background and the aroma of freshly ground coffee, maybe to see the light kind of refracted with rain outside. Actually, can we really pause with that experience and think, what's that actually like? And then really pay attention to that and use that to inform all the other debates we have around whatever topic we're discussing, rather than rushing to explain things. So Merleau-Ponty, who you mentioned, one of the kind of key figures from the 20th century in phenomenology, he said that true philosophy is relearning to look at the world. So really coming back again and again to looking at what's there, and being interested in that. So he talked about being a perpetual beginner. So a bit like in Zen, you have that idea of beginner's mind, and similarly in phenomenology. What is it to question and to be curious and to really be interested in our perception with one another, with the world around us, and explore the world from there, before and noticing when we get caught in theories and kind of abstract conversations, which may be useful, but sometimes take us away from actually what life is all about.
Interesting. It reminds me of that expression that in the US, when they, to be present, is it smell the coffee?
Yeah.
That
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, could you? One of the back to this this notion of questioning. In the essay, you talk about a specific Zen practice called "What is this?" Could you tell us something about that, and some questions that maybe some people could ask in relation to their digital lives?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So I've, just to set the context for this, with my reflections on kind of the nature of our relationship with tech, how we use technology and how it shapes our everyday lives, how it shapes our interactions with one another. We know that it's very fast paced. We know that there's no shortage of stimulation or updates or, notifications. And so there's no shortage of any of that, but actually what can get missed out is actually just being present, first of all, just to be with whatever's going on and not kind of thinking or scrolling to the next thing, and also to be curious in a kind of open-ended questioning way. So not questioning in terms of what's the answer to this. It's not so much questioning like, oh, I wonder, you're watching something on TV and let me just Google. That's a type of curiosity, and that's a type of questioning. But what I became interested to consider is vis-a-vis technology is, where is there maybe a great role for cultivating our capacity for ongoing open-ended questioning. And so Zen comes in here because there's a practice in Zen, a questioning practice, which Stephen Batchelor, who I think has been on the podcast, and Martine Batchelor, his wife, have been teaching for over 20 years. And it's a simple question. It's a simple practice of asking yourself, what is this? Vis-a-vis your moment-to-moment experience, and you rest with that question. And so the bachelors talk about how it's not a practice of finding answers, it's a practice of questioning, and you come back again and again. So the anchor to the practice, what you come back to, in the same way that with some meditation practices, maybe you come back to the sensations of breathing, or come back to sounds, for instance. In this particular practice, you come back and are anchored on this question, what is this? And so we can ask ourselves this about what's going on right now, just maybe noticing sensations in your backside, or the contact with the ground, or, just what we're seeing here together on Zoom. Just ask, okay, what is this? But you can ask that in all kind of aspects of life. And I think asking it vis-a-vis how we use tech, I think, can be very insightful, and we can unpack that. But the basic practice then is this one of questioning, what is this? And you come back again and again to that question.
That's great. I've been on a few of the bachelor's retreats, and they always do that at some point during the retreat. And remember them saying that, similar to what you're saying, that it's almost trying to create just seeing how curiosity feels in your body, or even sort of perplexity, or perhaps wonder at too, because often I often see an association between curiosity and wonder, and that's sometimes just dwelling in that feeling of unknowing, or wondering, is I find that just really interesting in itself.
Exactly, and exactly, and I think that openness to wonder, to not maybe knowing, but being maybe awed by what is, the smell of coffee, or many Zen practices very simple around our moment-to-moment experience of the world. And again, this links with the approach of phenomenology, where I said being curious about what you perceive, really an openness and wonder to what's there, and kind of the weirdness of the isness of a given moment. The Merleau-Ponty talks about the thisness of a rose, or a pebble, or some wax, the kind of ineffable quality of its being there. And we could describe it in lots of words, but actually we'll never be able to substitute what it is like to see it, or to perceive it. So what is this is a great way to come back to that wonder. And again, because you're not trying to solve things, you're not trying to work through problems, you're just resting with the question itself.
So is that related, because you talk about in the essay closing in on the mysteriousness of the world? Is that related to that in some way?
Yeah, so I think again, the pace and the design of our digital technologies can have this effect of almost pushing aside space for questioning in this open-ended way, or for really resting with the mysteriousness, the mystery of any experience. If you just maybe even look at the most mundane thing you can see around you, like just the play of light on the wall, something that you take for granted, and it's not maybe the most exciting thing, but actually really rest with that experience. And can you bring a curiosity and a wonder to everything that you see moment to moment around you? And I think that our technologies aren't very good at encouraging that resting with and that sense of wonder, because the way they work is through zeros and ones. The way that they're coded and encoded is often around, okay, well, what's next? And sure, here's some content, but maybe you want to see the next thing and the next thing. And of course, the economic incentives of all our digital media and social media platforms is very much for us to be looking at more and to scroll through more posts, and of course click on more ads. So there's no sense of being with the experience for its own sake. In a kind of capitalist kind of digital system, that doesn't really compute. And I think this issue of this closing in on the kind of mystery of our actual embodied experience that maybe kind of push to the margins a bit in our interactions and our experiences with tech, links to a term called tech solutionism, coined by the writer and thinker Evgeny Morozov, I think around 8 or so years ago now. But his idea of tech solutionism is the idea that technologies are always trying to solve problems for us, to fix things, to help us. Obviously GPS helps you get from A to B, and that's really helpful. But much more generally, every app on your phone is helping you kind of metaphorically get from A to B. Even an app for running or for meditation, for example, or for yoga, is likely, depending on who created the app and how it's funded and so on, but is likely to have some kind of gamification that, okay, so you've had 3 days in a row, so get another day of running in, and you can kind of continue your streak. Or there's lots of design features in our technologies which lead us to think about things which we may not otherwise think about as things to be optimized or problems to be solved. There's an app for everything. And of course, being able to do loads more things because of our tech, because of our smartphones is a great thing. The issue is this kind of mentality of solutionism, that everything is, you could easily, when you're using your phone a lot of the time and going from app to app, it can feel like everything is just a to-do list of things to check and things to do, and jobs to be done. And the way the design of the apps, like I said, really kind of creates this. So for instance, one ad for Google a few years back was talking about all the things you can do through Google, and the kind of catchline for the ad was make Google do it, make Google do it. So you don't need to do this or this or this, make Google do it. Or Twitter, for example, is often presented as, Twitter, it's what's going on in the world. So the idea is, you don't need to look at all these different sources. If you want to find out what's going on in the world, just check Twitter and you'll see it there. And on the one hand, of course, as we know, Twitter is in some way a certain mirror to the world and a reflection of what's going on or so on. But we also know, and probably don't need to talk about this in too much depth, that actually it's a very, very specific lens on what's going on in the world. And, I always say with that tagline of what's going on in the world, I think what opinions are doing the rounds at the moment, what opinions are going around the platform, because it's a very opinionated platform, and what opinions are going around our heads, because we tend to be very in our heads, I think, when we're using platforms like Twitter. So in many ways, our tech is presented as fixing things and making our life better, but it does inculcate this mentality of solutionism, of ticking boxes and getting things done, and what's going on with that. And that's where I think this approach of, in all of our personal approaches with tech and our conversations about tech in society, I think this Zen practice and the phenomenological orientation of asking the question, what is here? What's going on? What's this experience with tech like? I think is a great pushback to that paradigm, if you like, of tech solutionism, which I think is really entrenched in the systems that we're using today.
Sure. And what about other aspects of the online world which can be seen as problematic? Like, for example, it's often said, comparison is often the root of unhappiness, and it's like with sites like Facebook, most people they only put their best side, so you're only ever seeing someone in their best possible light generally. And then the fact that we talk about this disembodiment, that it's a bit like, when you're in a car, it's a lot easier to be rude to someone when someone cuts you up in traffic, because you've just got that bit more distance. Well, I think that's even more accentuated in the online world, because it's a lot easier to insult someone when you haven't got all these other. When you're in a room with someone, it's you have all these other signals coming along from our embodiment. But what sort of questions could you ask, in that regard, and what would not saying an answer, but how could we address that in some ways with this approach you're suggesting?
Sure. I think if we start with the kind of Instagram, Facebook kind of show reel of people's best selves and their holiday snaps and so on, start with that theme, because that's definitely very, very apparent, I think, for all of us. If you use a visual social media app like Instagram, it's typically the highlights reel of of people's lives, or something which is amazing or incredible, or something to be seen. And of course, as you said, that gives rise to comparison and to feeling insufficient in our own lives, perhaps. And I think what's interesting is the various kind of bursting forth of new apps are always trying to be on the cusp of keeping it authentic, just sharing real moments with your friend. Again, I talked about Zuckerberg just as an example. I mean, human connection is always very central in the rhetoric, whether it's about WhatsApp or about Facebook or about the metaverse or whatever it is, and Instagram, of course. And so what you find is the latest app du jour will say, oh yeah, those other ones, maybe Instagram is now become very performative and people are kind of comparing themselves to others. So for instance, there's a new app called Be Real, and the whole premise, as you can imagine, is it's designed with, I think, great with some great ideas in mind to help people be more authentic in what they're sharing. So for instance, you get a reminder at a random time each day to share whatever you're doing, and the way it works is you take a quick photo, and the idea is you're meant to just however mundane or however unmade up you are, you take a photo, and it will take a photo of how you're looking, but also using the other camera, a photo of what you're looking at, so people can see this is me and this is kind of where I am or what I'm looking at, and that's cool and everything.
Yeah,
there's various other features they've put into that app to try and make people not worry too much, about how their appearance is, and I commend that. But the fact remains that the decision to download an app, but to be on a daily basis doing that activity of taking a photo, this is me, this is what I'm looking at, that decision to take that selfie always reveals not just how we look in that moment in time, but the decision itself to pause and to take, we're interrupting our day. So I call it the paradox of presence, that even with the best intentions to try and keep things real and keep things authentic, I think that is something which is pretty unsurmountable. Like any online culture of sharing ourselves in tidbits to our social network, it can be great. I'm not saying these are bad things and we shouldn't do them. Where they kind of really try and say, this is just being who you are and sharing things with your friends. It's like, well, it is that, but it's doing that in a very particular way that is also always kind of, intercepting what we may actually be doing, such as the conversation me and you are having right now, or something else you may be doing with your time. So I think just, it's interesting to look at the different ways we can share content and look, for example, coming back to comparing to others. I mean, on Instagram, I follow a lot of visual artists, kind of less friends now, because I like looking at what they're up to and what they're working on. And I'm not an artist, so I have no comparison. Oh, wow, that's amazing, and my art's so bad. So I try and use apps in ways that I find creative and expressive, and think about which are the apps that I can use to connect with friends, which are the ones which I use to find out about the arts world or other kind of realms. But I think thinking about what's going on when we're using this app, just asking that question, what when we're looking through our feed, what is this feed of bodies, this feed of sunsets, and just asking the question can help us.
Well, that's helpful. Actually, for me, I mean, I'm really struggling to find a middle way. Like, I haven't used Facebook for a couple of years because I just find it a bit addictive. So I've stopped it completely. But then I'd like to find a balance, but I just struggle really. But I'm happy not using it. But I don't want to be a Luddite either. It's trying to find that middle way.
Yeah.
And anyway, that what you're talking about, the arts there, is it brings me on to my next question. As well as traditions like contemplative practice and phenomenology, how do you think artists can shed light on the problems facing us vis-a-vis tech and a possible way forward here?
Great question. And I mentioned earlier about the perspective of artists when it comes to how we're perceiving, how we're seeing the world around us is incredibly, as you'd expect, incredibly rich one. And in the essay you mentioned, I cite Dorothea Lange, who was the Depression era photographer, really documenting the experience, the resilience, but also the vulnerability of humanity in the migration west through the Great Depression in America. And she has some fantastic images of humanity in many people from many walks of life. But when it comes to this act of seeing, she says, and I say this at the beginning of the essay, Lang says, seeing is more than a physiological phenomenon. We see not only with our eyes, but with all that we are and all that our culture is. And so just coming back to what I said earlier about Mark Zuckerberg saying, actually, with our latest generation of technologies, our tech can really see the world as we see it. Or for instance, Google markets a camera, and the tagline and the way that it filters things, it says the latest camera can see you the way you see you, like rather than like how a camera would normally capture you. And I get what they're doing there, but implicit in those statements from Google and from Zuckerberg is that this thing of perception, seeing the world, hearing the world, our tech is pretty sophisticated now, so it can see what we see. But of course, coming back to Lang here, we see not only with our eyes, but with all that we are and all that our culture is. And it brings then a humility to this act of perceiving, this act of seeing, that says there's so much going on, actually, if we slow down and really look at what's there before us. And artists, Lang calls artists professional seers. That's their job, is to look carefully. And I've got a quote from her about slowing down. She says, I think this one's in the essay as well, but she says, this benefit of seeing can only come if you pause a while and extricate yourself from the maddening mob of quick impressions ceaselessly battering our lives and look thoughtfully at a quiet image. The viewer must be willing to pause, to look again, to meditate. And she's saying this, of course, in the probably early 60s, I think, but certainly well before the advent of the internet era. And she gives this other example, which again, I thought you'd be interested. Maybe I'll just read this one as well. She says, when it comes to slowing down and really looking at people and looking at situation you find yourself in, she says, the people who are garrulous and wear their heart on their sleeve and tell you everything, that's one kind of person. But the fellow who's hiding behind a tree and hoping you don't see him, he's the fellow you better find out why. And so often it's just sticking around and being there and remaining there, not swooping in and out in a cloud of dust. And anyone with an artistic practice, or for that matter, a contemplative practice, I think will appreciate, the value and the necessity of slow seeing, of being patient and really being curious and letting the world speak to us rather than grabbing and kind of grasping things very quickly. But again, coming back to how does this mesh with our digital lives? I think the way that we're invited to engage with the world is just the opposite of that. And so I think artists like Lang, and I cite others in other work I'm working on at the moment, really offer a great kind of rejoinder to that reductionist view that, seeing is kind of this passive thing. I've seen, again, I don't want to pick on Zuckerberg excessively, but I've seen him in an interview basically saying, again, he's talking about the metaverse. He's saying, when you're just watching TV and you're just kind of watching the screen, and he talks about, I think, being in like beta mode, which in itself I find kind of funny, but he's talking about, you're passive, you're just looking, whereas in the metaverse, when you put that screen on your eyes, but when you put that headset on, you're going to be absorbed, you're going to be engaged in the experience, you're going to be immersed, you're going to be doing things and touching things and moving around. And it's true that there will be more movement, more, in a sense, a certain kind of embodiment in the metaverse, maybe compared with staring at a screen. But what he misses, that actually, to be still and to be looking and to be curious about what you're seeing is kind of the absolute opposite of passivity in my mind. And I think Lang and those other quotes really speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might have mentioned it in one of your essays that there's often the assumption that the opposite of stimulation is boredom.
Yeah.
And from what Mark Zuckerberg is saying, that I'm very confident that he believes that too. Well, it's certainly that the algorithms are sort of built that way, but maybe because of our frenetic lives, that I mean, my experience when I first went on a retreat, what was really interesting when I went on a silent retreat for 6 or 7 days, the biggest thing I learned was that because you know, like if you imagine ecstasy, it's like you know how you feel is +10 and agony is -10. You know, when you're in your teens, you're probably going from a +7 to a -7. Then when you get to my age, it's +3 or 4. Then the oscillation slows. But when you're on retreat and you sat there for a long time, you're hovering around 0 and 1, and like, and you're hovering around neutral basically. And until that point, I'd really associated that because of the culture I live in partly, and with boredom. But actually, that's actually quite pleasant, you know. But I was fortunate to actually go on a retreat to experience that. I think it's a big task to actually get people to believe that. But I think this is what you're suggesting in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's interesting, you know, often the way it works with meditation, and I think with slowing down in general, actually, is, you know, I sometimes say to myself, if I'm busy and if I can't decide, this morning I've got a lot on, I've got a meeting coming up. If I can't decide whether to do a 10 or a 15-minute meditation, try and go for 20. When I'm not sure, you know, how long, but that's a signal to me that actually, okay, what about if I actually just double it? And of course, you maybe have to do it a bit later or move something around. But again, when it comes to going on a meditation retreat, you know, if I tell friends who've not been on one, oh yeah, 5 days of silence, it's like, wow, but what do you do? And like the image is like, wow, that must be so boring. What's really interesting is actually the longer it is, in many ways, the more, you know, layers of fascination may uncover. And you know, so I think Gandhi is, you know, back to the 10 or 15 minutes. I think Gandhi once said something quite similar. I'm paraphrasing, but I meditate for an hour every day, except when I don't have time, when I do 2 hours. So there's something very interesting. And again, this is touching on something which kind of, you know, the idea of like, oh, if I don't have time, I'll do 2 hours, not 1, from a kind of optimizing, very rational perspective. As an economist, I certainly, sadly, you know, inhabited that mindset for many years. And I think certainly the way tech operates is on this kind of optimizing basis. We're optimizing agents, and tech is designed also to be optimized so that we can use it to do as much as possible, to see as much as possible on our feeds and so on, and all the rest of it. But actually, the approach of slowing down says, what about doubling, doing nothing? And what would that be like? And actually, when you really give yourself to that, surrender, or like, you know, lean in and embrace the boredom, or embrace the seeming, quote, nothingness or mundane nature of things. Actually, if you bring the right approach, the right curiosity, actually it will be the opposite of that. So that, I think, in itself is a good rejoinder as well to this notion of tech solutionism.
Yeah. Okay. We're just coming to the end, near to the end, Dan, and I always ask people this question in the interview. So what's your understanding of the middle way in relation to what we've been talking about today?
So I think the middle way for me, when it comes to questioning our experience with tech and really being curious and asking that question, what is this about the experience we're having, and about maybe the tech systems that we're using and what's going on maybe beneath the surface. The middle way for me here is that through questioning, we maybe notice more about what's going on in our body, in our minds, in our habits, what we're seeing, and also maybe investigate more what's going on with why is Twitter just a whole load of opinions, and it says it's what's going on in the world, but it actually seems to be just a load of antagonism, and what's with that, what's going on with the design there. So on the one hand, this questioning gives us insight about our experience and about what our relationship with tech is like. But on the other hand, because as I said, the anchor is the question, we're not actually getting necessarily, certainly not final or fixed answers. We come back again and again to the question itself and actually rest with the question. So I guess that's a middle way in the sense of we're kind of doing this dance between asking and learning and kind of gaining greater understanding about things, but also honoring the question itself, the questioning itself as a place to rest. And so maybe finding ourselves constantly back and forth between questioning and exploring and finding out more, but also questioning as a place, as a kind of disposition, as a kind of orientation. Actually, that leaves us then, by always coming back to the questions, we come to this middle way again and again, because we don't take anything as, okay, I figured it out and that's how this is, or that's what's going on here. There's elements of that, but we come back to this open-ended questioning. So it's a bit kind of, I don't know, orthogonal perhaps to the middle way, but that for me, I mean, interested, does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, very much so.
The middle way from Buddhism, and I have a lot of respect for that. But does that?
Yeah. And then in relation to that, I mean, it's quite clear that the digital world, for all its benefits, it's having serious effects on lots of people's mental health, and it has problematic associations with how we view politics, etc. How hopeful do you think we can actually find more of a middle way in our approach to it?
I think, like I said, these social media platforms, they're teenagers effectively. I mean, they're still new technologies, and so I think the systems, the platforms are still quite an immature stage of development, and that's not criticism, because they're very impressive as well. And our relationship with them is also that. So I think we're still in a kind of entwinement with tech, where provocation, antagonism, kind of this kind of culture of conflict on Twitter and similar platforms still seems to hold sway, because of course this does get us riled up, and it does kind of provoke reaction and engagement therefore with the platform. So we're still in this phase where it does feel extremely polarized, and that, I don't think that will change anytime soon. But I do think as well, over time, people do appreciate, I mean, hopefully by asking these questions of like, what is this experience? Not just what are these views being shared, but what is it like? What's the experience of being on Twitter, checking Twitter, let's say 100 times a day, for a total of, let's say, 2 hours for the course of a day. Some people will be much less than that, of course, but some it will be more. And I think with questioning what that's like, hopefully people start to say, okay, human discourse has been so much better than this. It can be so much better than this. Are there other ways I can engage? And there's, lots of new forums, where people are experimenting different ways to disagree ultimately. And I think we can do much better than what we have seen over the last 10 years. I'm not sure how things will change in the nearer term, but I do have some hope that we can do better, and that will just be more fulfilling maybe for everyone involved.
Okay. And my last question, if people wanted to find out more about your work, Dan, how would they go about it?
So LinkedIn is probably the best kind of site that I have, where everything's there, and a lot of my published work is there. So yeah, if you search for Dan Nixon London on LinkedIn, you should find me.
Okay. Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today, Dan. Thank you very much.
No, the pleasure's been mine. Thank you so much for having me, Barry, and see you next time, maybe. Yeah.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.